Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin, and I'm the Analytics Marketing Manager at Unchained Labs. I will be your moderator, and thank you for joining us today. We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, and to ask questions during the presentation, all you have to do is click on the Q&A button in the Zoom navigation bar at the top or bottom of your screen and type in your question. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And now I'd like to introduce Rafar Jean-Gilles, the Field Application Scientist Director for our Analytics portfolio. I think I nailed it, but I'm sure he'll let me know. Today, Rafar will be taking us through UNCLE's unique ability to characterize proteins at high concentrations, kind of opening the door to look at proteins at real-world drug concentrations, but even earlier on in their developmental cycle. And so now I'll hand it off to Rafar for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us today. And so continuing with some of the webinar series that we've been doing, our goal is to essentially give you more insight, but certainly also to enable you to get more out of your therapeutics, right, as you can, using the right technologies. And so the title of today's talk, Flip the Script on High Concentration Proteins, really emphasizes the idea that most of our therapeutics, particularly in biologics, are formulated at really high concentrations, and we don't always have the right tools to do so. And so we're going to essentially show you how the UNCLE platform specifically is well suited to do so. But I want to also preface this by saying that if you take a look at our portfolio, the Lunatic, the Stunner, and other platforms that we have also do the same thing, right? They're able to reach really high concentrations, and they are designed with life sciences in mind, okay? So I'm going to start with this picture here, and I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and some of you may recognize what it is. If you do not, it's okay. It's a picture of Mount Everest, right? It's believed to be the highest peak on Earth, and it's an extremely challenging summit to overcome. And I think that's a perfect analogy for high concentration formulation. That's really what it is. And so every year, lots of people attempt to climb it. It takes quite a lot of time to even get acclimated to the altitude. And quite frankly, very few folks make it to the top, right? And it's a bit of a challenge, but it also becomes an indication of how good you are and how special and unique. And you enter this special club, if you want, as you would if you were to successfully deliver a therapeutic, right, to market. And that's ultimately what all of us are aiming to do. We're trying to essentially ascend, right, the peak of the Mount Everest, if you want, of therapeutics development, okay? And so continuing with this idea, if we take a look at the literature, it becomes pretty evident, right, that the need to formulate at high concentrations is there, but the ability to do so isn't always there based on current technologies available to us. And so what all of us aim to do is to overcome that challenge. And what we're being told, right, is that one of the big limitations is going to be solubility. But I want to go a step further and really say that once you start going above 100 milligram per ml, you also start seeing new properties that you had not necessarily anticipated when things were ideal. Let's say around 1 mg per ml, or typically less than 25 milligram per ml, right? So as you start crossing that threshold of concentration, you enter into a whole new domain with new properties. And being able to successfully characterize them present you with really interesting challenges. And so here we're being told that the concentration-dependent degradation route of aggregation is the greatest challenge to developing protein formulations at these higher concentrations, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is to get there. However, we know how challenging that can be simply because equipments are not really designed for that, okay? And finally, we're reminded that current technologies, so chromatographic and electrophoretic assays, may not accurately determine the non-covalent higher molecular weight, which is a very fancy way of saying aggregation, right, forms, because of the dilutions that are usually encountered with these techniques. Meaning that typically, if you and I want to characterize high concentrations, despite the fact that we know that we are operating with a stock solution that's above 100 mg per ml, we have to dilute them to accommodate the instrument, right, rather than actually characterizing our therapeutics where they may actually be currently formulated, okay? And to really drive this point home, let's take a look at the literature, right? There are lots of examples of therapeutics that are commercially available that are formulated at really high concentrations. And so you can see down below here, Ilaris at 150 milligram per ml, very common, and it's an anti-inflammatory therapeutic, right? And it's used to typically treat familial cold autoinflammatory syndrome. You also have Xolair, which is quite popular, at least this side of the world. And this one is also used for severe persistent asthma, for instance, right? It's a common therapeutic in that capacity. We can see Synagis over here, which is used to treat typically respiratory sentinel virus or RSV. And so you're actually using the antibody here to fight the infection, right, the viral infection, which is a pretty interesting approach. And finally, you have Tremfya at the very top here, which is used to treat, plaque psoriasis, right? And so all of those are used to treat a number of diseases. But what I want to emphasize here is that most of them are meant to be delivered at really high concentration. And the reason for it is because the higher the concentration, the more impact or the more efficacious your drug is going to be, because there's more therapeutics working there, right? And in other contexts, you may have a limitation in how much volume you can deliver. So for instance, one of our customers came to us and said, look, we're developing this therapeutic that has to be delivered in the eye. And as you can imagine, if you start putting a lot of liquid in the eye, you're going to increase the pressure, and that's going to cause other effects, right? So they're limited in the amount of volume that they can actually deliver, and therefore they have to concentrate their therapeutic as high as they can in order for them to have an impact. And so you are very much limited by how much you can put in. So you want to essentially overload the concentration in order to have the impact that you want. And for doing so, you want to also be able to characterize them at that concentration, right? So it's going to be what your patient essentially encounters. So when you and I think about therapeutics, right, beyond the standard development, they're going to go through a number of steps to even become close to entering the market. And so you're going to have temperature fluctuations, different steps of purification. As we go through formulation development, we're going to buffer exchange them, for instance. And finally, as they move downstream, right, they are going to essentially also have to withstand the scalability process and being able to manufacture them. And in doing so, we're going to concentrate them, and that's a big part of the equation. And so what exactly do we do when we have to do so? It's just going to give you an idea of the technologies that are currently in use for biologics characterization. You can see that there are quite a few. And each of them are meant to answer very specific questions about your therapeutics, right? So what is the stability of the samples? Do I have aggregation, and to which extent do I have aggregation? All of those are critical components of what can be done. And these are just some of the ones I've highlighted here that are a bit more critical as you begin to move downstream. So I'm going to give you just an example. Right? If I just take a fragment of those techniques that you and I will commonly use. So the top one here is differential scanning calorimetry. And so typically this one is done at about 1 milligram per ml. That is a standard, very common concentration used for it. And you can imagine, as we discussed, as you start going up to 50, right, 75, 100 milligram per ml, that is simply not suitable because it is not giving you an accurate depiction of what you actually have in your sample. An example here is SEC, and based on limitations due to the column, for instance, selection, you may also find that typically you're not going to exceed even 80 milligram per ml, which is quite high. Typically, people tend to remain well below that, right? We've seen cases where frequently you're staying at about 2 milligram per ml. To reach 80 is a pretty rare occurrence in this case, but it's possible. And as you begin to scale, it presents other challenges. And finally, SDS page, right? A very common technique. And here again, you're looking at, sub 2 milligram per ml concentration. So very typical of what you have. And for those reasons, those limitations make it extremely challenging to characterize proteins at their high concentrations. So our answer to this is the UNCLE, right? So some of you may have attended our talks before. If you have not, just very quickly, the UNCLE is a multiplex platform, which allows you to essentially characterize your biologics. And it is based around the idea that we've essentially paired up 3 detection methods. So fluorescence, static light scattering, and dynamic light scattering into one platform. This one has about 12 applications built in. The sample volume is only 9 microliters, right? So here we're able to address the small volume characterization. And of course, we'll see that we can address the high concentration goal that we have for this one. It has temperature built in, so we're able to go from 15 to 95 degrees Celsius. And of course, it's label-free measurement, meaning that it's all based on intrinsic fluorescence, right? So in short, what we really have here is this platform there that has the ability to characterize all of those 3 methods. So again, full spectrum fluorescence, static light scattering for aggregate detection, and dynamic light scattering to look at the exact size. And we'll see exactly how that's relevant based on the data to characterize your samples. Okay? And finally, this is of course based around the idea that's all temperature control. But I want to really bring your attention to one very small aspect of the UNCLE that often gets overlooked, which is that the upper limit allows you to characterize up to 300 milligram per ml. Right? And so we often have, customers who routinely do measurements at about 1 mg per ml, and that's normal if you're operating at the early stages of development. And as you begin to make your way downstream, you're going to typically increase the amount of sample that you produce, and you're able to operate at higher concentrations. But if you wait until it's too late, you're going to have surprises that show up downstream that you simply could not anticipate. And what we want to be able to highlight here is that we have a number of tools which allow you to address or de-risk some of those concerns as early as you can in the developmental process. Okay? And so the uncle allows you to measure up to 300 milligram per ml. That is pretty routine. It is protein dependent. Certainly, there are some differences here and there, but generally speaking, you can achieve much higher concentrations than you could on other platforms. And certainly you can do so at above 100 milligram per ml. As a reminder, all right, some of the raw data for the uncle consists of fluorescence. And so what you're viewing here is a denaturation curve where we're showing you an example of just 2 melting temperatures. The uncle can automatically assign up to 4 melting temperatures, right? And then you're also seeing concurrently, simultaneously being collected is going to be the aggregation data, which measures essentially what happens when you go from a small order, mostly monomeric form of your protein to an aggregated form of that protein. And of course, the protein can also undergo unfolding, and as it's unfolded, it then undergoes aggregation, right? Those 2 processes are possible. What we're doing here that's rather unique is the ability to show you that it is this unfolding event that is responsible for this aggregation event here. So that correlation is rather unique on the uncle platform because they happen at the same time, but they are independent of one another. And we'll see again why that's relevant, right? Because the goal isn't just to do so, it's to do so at the relevant concentration for your characterization. So this is the raw data showing an animation and the actual change in the raw spectrum for a protein. This is typically collected in the example here at a relatively low concentration. So let's say at about 1 to 10 milligram per ml. And the reason why I'm doing so is because I want you to really take a look at the appearance of this curve here, right? And to see exactly how it looks as it undergoes unfolding and denaturation. You have this very nice decrease in the intensity and a slight redshift that happens as your protein unfolds, which is characteristics of the opening, right, or the denaturation of the tertiary structure. As a reminder, because we collect a full spectrum, the raw data can be processed in a number of ways, right? So there's a so-called barycentric mean, which is the technique that we use commonly for the analysis, but you have the full option of selecting other ones. You have the integrated intensity, which is the area under the curve. You also have a classic method known as the fluorescence ratio, which is very common, 350 over 330, looking at the intensity as its 2 wavelength, give you a very nice appreciation of the progress of your unfolding. And you can certainly look at the peak height to determine how much unfolding you have. Okay. And so I'm going to show you progressively what happens as we look at concentration. So if I were to characterize a sample at 150 milligram per ml, this is a typical curve that I could obtain for it. And as you can see, I'm starting very close to 330 at about 335 nanometer. And this is an indication of a folded protein, right? And as it unfolds, you can see that I reach really, really high wavelengths here, which is a bit unusual, let's say. And as you go down in concentration, that number begins to decrease, right? So where you're starting remains about the same, which is to be expected. But you're seeing that you have some differences that are pretty interesting in the actual apparent final state, if you want, of your protein. So what exactly happened here as we go from 12.5 to 150 milligram per ml, right? And so this will suggest to you that somehow at 150, you are more quote unquote unfolded than you are at 12.5. And that is not true, right? And that's actually what I want to say here is that there are colligative changes happening. There are changes that are happening that are based on the amount of sample that you have present, certainly yes, but it is not exclusively unfolding that's happening here. And so this is showing you the BCM, but some of you may be more comfortable with the fluorescence ratio. So I'm going to quickly show you that analysis method for the exact same samples. And you can see that the actual pattern doesn't change. It's a bit more noisy because that's a reflection of the actual sample itself. But certainly you can see that the progression is pretty typical. And you can see also that the extent to which the unfolding takes place for lower concentrations appears to be less pronounced, right, than higher concentrations. And so if you now want to look at structure more carefully, here's exactly what you see if you look at the raw data, right? So if you recall momentarily, I showed you a rather ideal depiction of a low concentration sample, right, which looked like this, right? And we saw a pretty orderly way of unfolding your sample. And then as you and I make it to a higher concentration, we see that things can look quite different here, okay? So what exactly is taking place? Well, you're getting a lot more scattering, right? Because your sample is actually beginning to aggregate, but you may also have some gel-like formation. You have micron-sized particles that are forming, right? And so all of those are going to lead to rather unusual backscatter and Raman type of scattering that can take place. And this is what you're viewing here. And the reason why it's so important is because it gives you an exceptionally remarkable insight into the structure of your sample. In other words, it is not simply that your samples are aggregated, right? They actually are stuck together, and being that close to each other actually can lead to rather unusual properties. So you and I will often say, well, at high concentrations, I have aggregation. That is actually not true of every sample, right? There are samples which can be formulated at high concentrations. What this allows you to do is to know whether or not this is actually happening as a result of concentration or as a result of the properties of your sample itself. So it's a rather interesting way to look at it. Another way to think of this is that if I were to overlay the actual curve of the samples for the aggregation itself, right? If you recall, aggregation is simply a look at the intensity as a function of temperature. And so presumably the more aggregated you are, the larger your particles are, and therefore the more light they should scatter. And also the higher the concentration, the more light you should scatter. But you will note something rather interesting is that here I am at 266 nanometer, and the lowest concentration appears to have the highest inflection or the highest increase, right, in its intensity, right, in its light scattered. And that's rather interesting to note. If I show you the exact same sample at 473, you may note that now for all of them, we see a rather pronounced amount of amount of aggregation. And you can see that the one at 12.5 is actually not as exceptional as the other ones, for instance. And so why is that the case? It's because the two wavelengths measure rather different, they have different sensitivities if you want to the changes that we're observing. So at 266 nanometer, we are much more sensitive to lower concentrations and smaller sizes, right? At 473 nanometer, we are much more well suited for higher concentrations and higher sized particles. And this has to do with the way light is absorbed at lower wavelength, for instance. Yeah. The other thing that can happen is that you have the so-called inner filter effect. And so this property here reflects the idea that light doesn't make it to the innermost sphere of your sample. And as a result of it, the apparent intensity appears to be lower. And so here we can see that at 25 degrees Celsius, right, you're seeing that the intensity appears to be lower in some instances for your sample, which doesn't make sense because presumably as your protein unfolds and aggregates, it should actually have a higher intensity. And we see that this isn't really the case, even if you're starting at 300 milligram per ml. Those are really, really low numbers. Right? Typically, you would expect those numbers to be on the scale of 3,000, 6,000, 8,000, and even up to a few tens to hundreds of thousands, depending on the actual sample. And so when you're seeing things that low, it could be indicative that you have an inner filter effect happening, which typically means that only the surface of your sample is able to fluoresce light. The rest of it is simply trapped within the inner sphere, if you want, of the sample itself. It's a rather interesting process to be aware of because you may wonder whether it's impacting the actual data. What's really neat about the ENCODE itself is that we're able to characterize the samples even as they go above those concentration threshold. This is an example using BSA as we go from 300 milligram per ml down to about 150 mg per ml here. And we have previously shown examples of low concentrations, and I will encourage you to go to unchainedlab.com or to visit our other channels to look at those. But what I want to highlight here is really what happens at high concentrations. And what you may note is that the actual melting temperature, right, is about 70, 71 or so, 72. And at 250, it's about 72, 73, and 73, 74. And we seem to go up a little bit to 76 here, right? And so what you are viewing here is a concentration dependence, right, of the actual melting temperature. It's important to note because it gives you, again, insight into what could be happening. If I look at the aggregation, I can also note that the Tagg at 266, in other words, the formation of smaller particles may appear to show up a little bit later, whereas at 473, we appear to detect things earlier, right? And that's again a function of the fact that at high concentration, the higher wavelength is much more relevant than the lower one because this one is less sensitive at high concentrations. Again, that ability to discern between small particles and large particles, high concentrations and low concentrations is rather unique on the ENCODE platform. if you look at IgGs, right, and so this is an example looking at 350 milligram per ml. So we saw this inner filter effect here, but I'm adding this to remind you of what happens if you look at the actual consequence of that on your results. And so here we can see again that we have the ability to characterize our melting temperatures as we go from 350 all the way down to 150. But you may see again a slight change in the melting temperature from about 72 here, right, all the way down to about 68 here. And so again, that gradual decrease in TM is a function of the actual concentration. And so one could actually argue that at a higher concentration, your sample is actually stabilized, right, by simply the density that happens. It's congested, and therefore the structure doesn't have the ability to relax. So the rather unique raw spectra that I showed you before with the very unique peaks that you were seeing there actually is indicative of a very densely packed structure, which ironically enough can either be aggregation or can be actually favorable to you because it appears to give it a quite like a gel-like structure that actually stabilizes your structure. So it's a rather unique way to think of it. But what we think of aggregation may not be as bad if it's reversible. In fact, as you dilute your way down, that phenomenon goes away, which is actually good in terms of not having something that's not irreversible. And so again, we look at the SLS here. So we can see that at 266, we're getting a Tagg that's a bit elevated. And then at 473, we're able to be much more sensitive, and we can pick up an earlier onset in the change in the average molecular weight of our sample. Right? And so the reason why we emphasize this is because we want to make sure that you appreciate what happens at high concentrations. And so here you can see that at very low concentrations, the melting temperature in green is lower than the actual Taggs that we picked up. And as we start moving up in concentrations, again, crossing the 100 milligram per ml threshold, you can see there's a bit of a reversal where the sample appears to aggregate at a much earlier temperature than it unfolds. And really it's saying to you that that sample is actually so densely packed, right, that's going to actually scatter more light sooner than it would before the tertiary structure itself is impacted. So this is actually a function of the colloidal behavior of your sample. If those two were to be reversed, then that will actually mean that you truly have unfolding, and therefore your structure is not stable at a high concentration. And as we talked about, the UNCLE measures TM, Tagg, and DLS, right? So fluorescence, SLS, and dynamic light scattering. And so here you are viewing, again, the same samples as we go from 150 to 12.5. And what I want to emphasize here are a few things. So what we're showing you here is the correlogram, or the correlation function for that sample. It's the raw data for DLS. And so presumably, the longer it takes for a signal to decay, the larger you are. And so we can see that at a high concentration, it takes a bit more time before it begins to go down, whereas at lower concentrations, it goes down a little bit sooner. But what I'm showing you with the arrow there is that the baseline doesn't quite get flat here, right? And so you have this jagged noise that happens. And again, that's telling you that that structure is very dense, and you have a quasi-gel-like particle or quasi-gel-like material that's operating that's existing in your sample. If you then go and quantify this in terms of size, look exactly what happens here. As we go from 24 millimeter for the diameter at 150, and as we go down just to 100 milligram per ml, we start getting closer to an ideal size at about 20 millimeter or so. This may seem trivial, right? That difference of about 5 millimeter in perceived size, right? This is just a diameter, right? And so that can actually result in almost a twofold difference, if not higher, in the actual volume. Right? So just be mindful of that. So this one here can be on the order of maybe 16 or just much higher volumes than just a 5 millimeter difference. And so that difference makes all the difference, quite frankly. So as you think about operating at high concentrations, DLS has one limitation that's built into it, and that's a factor of DLS, right? Simply that there's something called multiple scattering. And so what it actually means is that as your laser comes in, it enters again your particle, and it's going to bounce around multiple times before it scatters back to the detector, right? And that's called multiple scattering. The consequence of that is that as you start reaching multiple scattering, the apparent size of your sample will appear to be smaller because your sample will have lost energy, right, as the particle just bounces around before the photon makes it back to your detector. And what we recommend to people is to do a dilution series. If you start going above a certain concentration, but you want to accurately measure your size, simply do a dilution and you'll see when your linearity is no longer there, and that will give you an indication that you have in fact crossed over the threshold where multiple scattering is taking place. It's a very unique way of doing so, but it's a very useful insight into your sample stability. Okay? And so speaking of light scattering, you can also do something rather interesting using the Kirkwood-Buff integral, which looks at high concentration protein-protein interaction. Specifically, it's something that we call G22, right? And so if you're familiar with the B22 analogy, it's somewhat similar to that, except that this one is actually created specifically to look at high concentrations and what happens as you start crossing over the 50 to 100 milligram per ml threshold, right? Because your samples become essentially much more tightly packed, and you're going to have to be mindful of this. And so what makes it unique is that it does so at a high concentration. And the way you typically interpret that is that if you have a high G22 value, as in greater than 0, you have attractive forces. In other words, that is bad if you're trying to avoid aggregation. If you have a G22 value that is negative, then that's going to be repulsive, meaning that your samples are able to have some level of independence and they can freely diffuse around each other, and it's actually good. And of course, a G22 of 0 is neutral, and that will generally be looked at as a favorable way to think of this. Again, if you're familiar with B22, the interpretation is the exact opposite of how you think of B22. So if you look at some examples of data, right, you can see here that you have a G22 value that's highlighted here at about 5.24, which will be bad. And then you have one that's at negative 3.09, which will be good. And you can see again that there's a lesser increase in the intensity as you go up in concentration that you have in the blue here, which means that this one is scattering more light. Presumably there's more interaction, which will be again bad. An example of a therapeutic, right? So if you're looking at adalimumab here, and we've gone from 100 to 70 milligram per ml, and you can see the impact that it has on the G22 value, which isn't really that much, which is good. And so they're all negative values, which also is an indication of a repulsive interaction, which is something that we want. What I'm showing you here is that there's also a bit of a plateauing that happens, right? We're no longer as linear as we were. And so at some point, the concentration, let's just say dependence and stabilization that can happen begins to be a bit more apparent. And so if you're now able to look at that data converted from the intensity to the G22, what you're viewing here is a bit of a plateauing effect that can happen, right? And so as that sample begins to go up to a certain concentration, there isn't a drastic difference in the G22 value, which usually means for you that at some point, somewhere around here, there's no more added benefit, or certainly there's nothing worse happening, right, as you go there. So if your buffer is able to withstand it, then you're fine. If it's not, then certainly you have some wiggle room to find the right concentration. Okay. And so hopefully you've appreciated just a quick overview of what high concentration characterization can mean for you using the UNCLE platform. Whether you are a new user or an existing user, we wanted to give you the ability to essentially make it to the top, right, of Mount Everest. And so this is actually a real picture. And every year, at a certain time of the year, about 500 people every day attempt to climb it, which is rather amazing given that it's a pretty risky path, if you want. But with the UNCLE platform, we're able to hopefully offer you the right tools and the right equipment so that you can actually easily traverse the difficult pathway of reaching market at high concentrations. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us, and I will happily take your questions. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much for that presentation, Rafar. Just kind of thinking about what that covered and some of the notes that I took on that. We started by looking at the importance and the challenges of characterizing high concentration protein therapeutics. Mm-hmm. And then pivoted and looked at how unfolding behavior looks on the UNCLE and how that looks for a few different example proteins, right. Similarly with SLS data and aggregation. Mm-hmm. And then also took a look at some of the scientific phenomena that happen at high concentrations, like the interfilter effect that you can be aware of. Yes. And then kind of wrapped up by looking at DLS information and some best practices for understanding high concentration data on DLS, and G22 as another metric that you can use to look at protein-protein interactions.
That's correct.
Sound about right? Complete?
That sounds right, yes.
Great. So now I'm going to take a look at the questions that we have come in through the Zoom Q&A function. So if you have more questions, feel free to hit that Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen and type it in, and we'll get to it. So we have a couple of questions already coming in. Okay. And the first one, can you explain why there is a difference for your two SLS lasers at those high concentrations?
Sure, absolutely, yes. So there tends to be a non-specific absorption that we see at 266 nanometers. So lower wavelengths tend to not have the ability to absorb as much light or to not be impacted by it. And so when you have samples that are really concentrated or that are very large, they scatter more light. And so you have a non-specific adsorption or loss of light that happens there. At 473, that phenomenon is less prevalent, and therefore it's able to withstand it, and you have much greater resolution at high concentrations.
Okay. If I'm working on formulating high concentration proteins, looking at all the information and data that you presented today, what metrics should I start with?
It's a good question, yeah. So I would still say start with the fluorescence, right? And again, I'm assuming that you have an uncle, of course. But the idea there is that we've demonstrated to you that we have the ability to characterize it, and it will give you wonderful insight into your structure. So the TM, TAG, DLS application is the right way to go. And what it's going to tell you is whether or not your structure is impacted by that higher concentration. And then from there, you can look at the SLS and the DLS because they're concurrently measured within this application. But I think if you think about the ultimate goal of this approach, high concentration, it's to still develop a therapeutic that is therapeutically active, meaning that has proper structure to have a good impact on your patient's outcome, right? And so you still want to look at structure anytime you can, and then look at whether aggregation is going to impact the bioavailability of your therapeutics as you deliver them.
So since you can do full spectrum fluorescence detection, can you adjust the analysis to kind of accommodate those unusual scattering patterns and odd fluorescent behavior that you showed?
Yeah, you absolutely can. That's a good question. Yeah. So if you think about the analysis method that we showed, the BCM, the fluorescence ratio, the area, or the peak intensity, right? So they have predefined range of the spectrum that they're analyzing. But as a user, we give you full control. And so you can actually decide that you may not want to look at the full range that we have added there, but you simply can edit that and further fine tune it to your specific case. And so you do have the ability to change that. So let's say that from 300 to 450 is the default method, and you saw something that happened at 430, you could certainly scale it back down to below 400, for instance, and look at the analysis range there.
Okay. And then you did mention at the end, looking at G22 or the Kirkwood-Buff integral, instead of B22 to look at protein-protein interactions. How do you determine when to use which measurement?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So a few things must be said, right? So the two methods are somewhat related because they're all based on the idea that light scatters intensity differently at higher concentrations. There's an equation that has been derived, and we can make it available to you. It's in the application note for G22. You can find that at our website. And essentially, it actually allows you to look at the impact of a B22 value and the molecular weight on a given, if you want, ratio or parameter, right? And so if you are above that threshold, then one method is recommended, which may be G22. If you are below that threshold, then the B22 will be recommended. The other benefit of our platform is that with the click of one button, you can simply convert B22 data into G22 data, and vice versa. You can go backwards and go from G22 into B22. Or the other way. But certainly the ability to go back and forth between each is made easy, and you can validate that using that equation. It's quite easy, yes.
Okay. Both ways, two-way street.
That's correct, yes.
So can you talk about, maybe think about the different detection methods that we looked at, the fluorescence, the SLS, and the DLS. Mm-hmm. How might those change as you run into an upper limit of protein concentration?
Sure, that's fair. Okay, so let's start with the fluorescence, right? So what we saw here is that a few things can happen. So you could have a case where you have essentially the inner filter effect, or which is a bit of, not exactly, but we often call it quenching, but it's a bit of a slightly different phenomenon, but it's the idea that the signal is attenuated, right? So it appears to be lower than you would expect. What you would not expect is that as the concentration goes up, the intensity goes up. What we see when we have inner filter effect is that if we were to measure a high concentration sample and a low one, the lower one will have a higher signal, and therefore we can pretty much be sure that we have some sort of inner filter effect. So that's something that could happen, and we've also seen that you have the additional scattering that can happen in the fluorescence. So that's one possibility. As a result of that, your melting temperatures may also change, and which again could be really insightful because we may see that you have some concentration dependence on TM and other stability factors there. For Tagg, we can see again that 266 really well suited for low concentrations. In fact, I will often tell people that as you operate it below, let's say 10, 20, 25 milligram per ml, 266 and 473 are fine. They give you very nice insight into the formation of small aggregates and then larger aggregates at 473. As you start crossing over to higher concentrations, I will put more weight on the 473 because that will give you additional insight into what you might have, right? And then finally, the DLS measures size exactly. And so this one will give you a very direct way of saying, yes, my particles have gotten larger on average, or they remained at the same size as they were initially.
Right. Okay, so let's see. I'm also thinking of, about the example that we showed, I believe it was BSA, where area was on the y-axis, and that was showing exactly what you were talking about with the interfilter effect, where the higher concentration samples had lower signal than the lower concentration samples.
That is correct, yes, yeah. And it's not really intuitive, right? I think most people tend to assume that it will just kind of continue forever to go in this direction, but it doesn't. We see that as you reach a certain threshold, we see the opposite happen where the intensity actually begins to go down, and one has to be mindful of that.
Right. Okay, so we have, I think we're hitting at the end of our time here. So there's a couple other questions that we'll follow up with after the presentation. But in the meanwhile, I want to thank Rafar for the very insightful presentation.
Thank you very much.
And then thanks for answering all the great questions. And also want to thank all of you who joined us live today. If you want to have a deeper conversation with our team, please do get in touch with us. We would love to connect with you. So in the meanwhile, we'll reach out to those few remaining questions. And thank you again for attending our virtual seminar. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.